In the glittering ballroom of Santa Barbara's most exclusive charity gala, 23-year-old Ellie stands alone and silent, wearing the only dress she owns, a simple lilac garment with a crooked seam sewn by her mother's dying hands. When a wealthy socialite publicly humiliates her, tearing the precious dress from shoulder to waist, Ellie's world shatters. But one man in the room can't take his eyes off that imperfect seam, a seam he recognizes from 20 years ago. What connects this deaf young woman to billionaire philanthropist Grant Ellington? Why does his wife Meredith seem determined to keep them apart at any cost? And what secrets lie hidden in the threads of a lilac dress? Secrets that could unravel 3 lives and expose decades of carefully constructed lies? This heartbreaking story of lost connections and found family will leave you in tears as it reveals how the places where we break can become our greatest strength when mended with love. Follow our channel for more emotional true stories that will change the way you see the world. And don't forget to like and comment below, telling us where you're watching from. The crystalline chandeliers cast a golden glow across the polished marble floors of the Bellamy Hotel ballroom. Santa Barbara's elite mingled beneath them, their laughter rising and falling like carefully orchestrated music. In this sea of designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos, 23-year-old Ellie Templeton stood alone, a silent island of uncertainty. Her lilac dress, the only formal garment she owned, hung awkwardly from her slender frame. The slightly crooked seam on the right shoulder caught the light every time she moved. Fingers trembling, she traced that imperfect stitching, the last tangible connection to her mother who had sewn it with failing hands before cancer took her 3 years ago. "You shouldn't be here," Ellie thought to herself, eyes fixed on the intricate patterns of the marble floor. She hadn't intended to crash this wedding reception. Her roommate from the university laundry service where she worked had mistakenly given her the invitation, thinking it was for some campus event. By the time Ellie realized the error, curiosity had already pulled her through those ornate double doors. Nobody here knew her secret, that since age 3, she hadn't heard a single sound. They didn't know how she'd learned to read lips with perfect precision, or how she practiced her speaking voice in empty rooms, never quite sure if the words came out right. They didn't know that her smile was carefully calibrated, practiced in mirrors until it looked natural enough to pass. Around her, conversations flowed like expensive champagne, inaccessible currents she could only partially read from shifting lips. A waiter offered her a flute of something sparkling. She took it with a practiced nod of thanks, not trusting her voice in this environment. In the corner, a string quartet played something that made the guests sway slightly. Ellie watched their synchronized movements, a dance she could see but never hear. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine belonging here, in this world of wealth and effortless grace. That's when she felt it, the weight of scrutinizing eyes. She turned to find a woman staring at her from across the room. The woman's hair was styled in an immaculate silver updo, her emerald gown draped perfectly across her slender frame. But it was her eyes that made Ellie's breath catch, cold, calculating, and fixed directly on Ellie's dress. The woman whispered something to her companion, then began moving toward Ellie with determined steps. Each click of her heels against the marble floor was a silent countdown to confrontation. "Excuse me," the woman said, her lips forming the words with exaggerated precision. "Are you with the catering staff? Because you're certainly not dressed appropriately for a guest." Ellie shook her head, struggling to find her voice. "No, This is the Ellington Foundation's annual charity gala, not some community college mixer," the woman continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that Ellie could still read clearly from her lips. "That garment you're wearing is absolutely destroying the aesthetic we've worked so hard to create." Heat rushed to Ellie's cheeks. Around them, conversations began to falter as curious eyes turned their way. The woman, clearly someone important, was making a scene, and Ellie had become its unwilling center. "I'm sorry, there was a misunderstanding," Ellie managed to say, her voice sounding strange even to herself. "I'll leave right away." The woman's perfectly painted lips curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "Oh, sweetheart, the damage is already done." Her manicured hand suddenly reached out, fingers grasping the delicate lilac fabric of Ellie's dress. "This isn't even properly made. Look at this dreadful seam." Before Ellie could react, the woman tugged sharply at the fabric, her expression twisted with casual cruelty. The sound of tearing cloth was lost to Ellie's deaf ears, but the vibration of the ripping traveled up through her body like an electric shock. The delicate lilac material, her mother's final gift, split from shoulder to waist, exposing her slip underneath. Time seemed to stop. The room fell into stunned silence, a silence Ellie had lived in her entire life, but now seemed to have engulfed everyone else too. Dozens of eyes stared at her, some with shock, others with pity, a few with poorly disguised amusement. The woman stepped back, satisfaction flickering across her features. "Now everyone can see what doesn't belong," she said, her words clear on her lips. Tears burned in Ellie's eyes as she clutched the torn fabric to her chest. Her fingers found the crooked seam again, the imperfect stitches her mother had sewn while teaching Ellie that beauty wasn't about perfection, but about love embedded in every thread. Through the blur of her tears, Ellie noticed a man standing at the far end of the room. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at her with pity or disdain. Instead, his eyes, intense and strangely familiar, were fixed on the torn dress, on that crooked seam her fingers still clutched desperately. For a heartbeat, something like recognition crossed his face, followed by a shadow of pain so profound it mirrored her own. Then the moment broke as Ellie turned and fled, pushing past the whispers and stares, clutching the remnants of her mother's last gift as she ran from the glittering ballroom and out into the cool California night. Behind her, the man remained frozen, staring at the empty space where she had stood, his world suddenly and inexplicably altered by a glimpse of a crooked seam on a torn lilac dress. Grant Ellington stood motionless at the far end of the ballroom, his champagne flute forgotten in his hand. The world around him, the sparkling lights, the murmuring guests, even the string quartet, had faded to background noise. All he could see was the ghost of a young woman who had just fled the room, clutching the remains of a torn lilac dress. But it wasn't the woman who had captured his attention. It was that dress. More specifically, the distinctive, slightly crooked seam along its right shoulder. A seam that shouldn't exist anywhere but in his memories. "Grant, are you listening to me?" The sharp voice of his wife, Meredith, cut through his thoughts like a blade. She stood beside him now, her emerald dress catching the light as she shifted impatiently. "I'm sorry. What were you saying?" Grant replied, his eyes still fixed on the doorway where the young woman had disappeared. Meredith followed his gaze, her perfectly lined lips pursing slightly. "Oh, don't concern yourself with that little incident. Just some girl who clearly didn't belong here. I had to intervene before she embarrassed herself further." Grant turned to look at his wife of 15 years, seeing her as if for the first time. "You did that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You tore her dress?" Meredith rolled her eyes. "Please, Grant. It was practically falling apart anyway. And honestly, who wears homemade clothes to the Ellington Foundation Gala? It was like she was trying to make a mockery of everything we stand for." Without another word, Grant handed his champagne flute to a passing waiter and walked away from his wife, ignoring her indignant call of his name. He moved through the crowd with purpose, nodding mechanically at board members and donors who tried to engage him. Once in the hotel's magnificent garden, Grant stopped and drew a deep breath of the cool evening air, heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. The gardens were illuminated by elegant copper lanterns that cast pools of warm light onto the stone pathways. It was here, among the carefully tended roses and ornamental fountains, that he spotted her. The young woman sat alone on a marble bench, half hidden behind a flowering hedge. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she clutched the torn fabric of her dress. Even from a distance, Grant could see that same crooked seam that had stopped his heart cold moments earlier. 20 years ago, he had watched a woman he loved sew that exact same imperfect seam, a woman named Eleanor Templeton, who had disappeared from his life without warning, leaving behind only a handwritten note and a chest containing scraps of fabric, including that distinctive lilac material with its slightly uneven weave. Grant stepped forward, then hesitated. The young woman couldn't be more than 23 or 24. The timing was right, but surely it was just a coincidence. Eleanor had left him, gone back to her family who disapproved of their relationship. There had been no mention of a pregnancy, no hint that she might have been carrying his child. And yet, as the young woman raised her head and briefly turned in his direction, Grant felt the air leave his lungs. There was something in the curve of her cheek, the shape of her brow, echoes of the woman he had once loved with every fiber of his being. Before he could approach her, the young woman stood abruptly and hurried away, disappearing down a garden path that led to the street. Grant remained frozen, torn between following her and returning to the gala where his absence would soon be noticed. His phone vibrated in his pocket, undoubtedly Meredith wondering where he'd gone. With a last look at the empty bench, Grant turned back toward the ballroom, his mind racing with possibilities and impossibilities. When he re-entered the ballroom, the party continued as if nothing had happened. Meredith stood in the center of a circle of admirers, laughing at something one of them had said. The emerald necklace at her throat caught the light as she turned her head, and something about it made Grant pause. The pendant hanging from the delicate chain wasn't the diamond piece she'd been wearing earlier. This was an antique locket, oval-shaped with intricate filigree work. A locket he hadn't seen in 20 years, not since it had hung around Eleanor Templeton's neck. Grant crossed the room in long strides, his heart pounding against his ribs. As he approached, Meredith saw him coming, and her laugh faltered slightly before she recovered her composure. "There you are, darling," she said, reaching out to take his arm. Everyone's been asking where the man of the hour disappeared to. Grant's eyes remained fixed on the locket. "That's new," he said quietly, indicating the piece with a slight nod. Meredith's hand went reflexively to the pendant. "Oh, this old thing? I found it in one of the storage boxes in the attic. Thought it would complement the dress nicely." It was a lie. Grant knew it was a lie because he'd sealed that locket away himself after Eleanor left, placing it in a chest with her other belongings. A chest that had mysteriously disappeared from their attic 3 years ago. A chest that had contained, among other things, several yards of lilac fabric with a distinctive, slightly uneven weave. "It suits you," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over connections that seemed impossible yet undeniable. The timing of the chest's disappearance, the young woman's age, that unmistakable seam in the lilac dress. As Meredith turned back to her conversation, Grant discreetly gestured to Jackson, his head of security. "The young woman who just left, the one in the torn dress. I need to know who she is." Jackson nodded once, already reaching for his phone. "I'll have the reception team check the guest list and review the security footage." "Thank you," Grant said quietly, his eyes drifting back to his wife and the locket that shouldn't be around her neck. A cold feeling settled in his stomach as pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle began to shift into new and unsettling patterns. The city bus rumbled through the dimly lit streets of Santa Barbara, its headlights cutting through the coastal fog that had rolled in after sunset. Ellie sat alone near the back, clutching a plastic shopping bag containing the ruins of her mother's dress. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the thin plastic, knuckles white with tension. The shame of what had happened burned in her chest like a physical wound. The bus wasn't crowded at this hour. Just a few night shift workers, a couple of students, and an elderly man dozing in the front row. No one paid any attention to the young woman with red-rimmed eyes and hunched shoulders. No one except a teenage boy who sat across the aisle, his head bobbing to music playing through oversized headphones. Ellie watched his lips move silently, forming words to a song she couldn't hear. It was a habit she'd developed over the years, observing people experiencing sound, trying to imagine what it might be like. The boy's expression was peaceful, transported to some place beyond the fluorescent-lit confines of the city bus. The sight triggered a memory so vivid it made her chest ache. Her mother sitting beside her bed, lips moving to form a lullaby, fingers gently stroking her hair. Ellie had been 5 years old, already 2 years into her world of silence. She remembered placing her small hand against her mother's throat, feeling the vibrations of the song she couldn't hear. "Lavender's blue dilly dilly," her mother had mouthed, exaggerating each syllable so Ellie could read her lips. It had been her favorite song, and lilac, the closest color to lavender they could find in the fabric store, had been her mother's favorite color. Ellie had grown to hate it after her mother's death, each glimpse of that particular shade a reminder of all she had lost. The bus lurched to a stop, jolting Ellie from her memories. She glanced out the window and realized she had missed her usual stop. With a sigh, she pulled the signal cord and stood, swaying slightly as the bus began moving again. The teenage boy glanced up as she passed, his eyes widening slightly at the tear tracks on her face, but he quickly looked away. 5 minutes later, Ellie was walking up the cracked concrete path to the small bungalow she shared with her Aunt Patricia. The porch light was on, Aunt Patty's way of guiding her home, though Ellie had told her countless times it wasn't necessary. The light meant her aunt was still awake, probably waiting up for her. Ellie wasn't ready to explain what had happened, to see the mix of pity and helpless anger in her aunt's eyes. Instead of going inside, she sank down onto the porch steps, the shopping bag with her ruined dress resting beside her. The night air was cool against her face, carrying the faint scent of the ocean mixed with their neighbors' jasmine bushes. Above, the stars were mostly hidden by fog, just a few pinpricks of light visible through the haze. Ellie closed her eyes and tried to imagine the sound of the waves breaking against the shore a few miles away. What did the night sound like to others? The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the whisper of the wind, all just concepts to her, words without meaning. Sometimes she wondered if the silence in her head was the same as the silence others experienced, or if it was something altogether different, something uniquely hers. With a deep breath, she reached into the shopping bag and carefully withdrew the torn dress. The lilac fabric seemed dull in the yellow porch light, the rip extending from shoulder to waist like an ugly scar. Her fingers found the crooked seam automatically, tracing the slightly uneven stitches. Her mother had been so weak by then, the cancer eating away at her strength, but she'd insisted on finishing the dress. "For your graduation," she had mouthed to Ellie, "and for other special days when I can't be there." A graduation that had come 2 years after her death. A dress that had hung unworn in Ellie's closet until tonight, the first special occasion she'd had since losing her mother, and now it was ruined, destroyed by a stranger's casual cruelty. A tear slipped down Ellie's cheek, followed by another. She made no sound as she cried. She never did. Having never heard herself cry, she had no idea how to modulate the sound, so she had learned to weep in silence. The porch light suddenly flickered once, twice. Aunt Patty signaled that she knew Ellie was home. A moment later, the front door opened, spilling warm light onto the steps. "Ellie? Sweetheart? What are you doing sitting out here?" Her aunt's concerned face appeared in the doorway. As soon as she saw the tears in the torn dress, her expression shifted to one of alarm. "Oh, honey, what happened?" Ellie shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Aunt Patty came down the steps and sat beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. She didn't press for answers, just sat in companionable silence, a concept Ellie understood all too well. Eventually, Ellie would go inside. She would explain about the gala, the mistake, the cruel woman who had torn her dress, but not yet. For now, she just wanted to sit in the quiet night with the ghost of her mother's stitches beneath her fingertips. Meanwhile, across town, Grant Ellington sat in his home office. The lights of Santa Barbara spread out below the hillside mansion's picture windows. On his desk, a manila folder lay open, containing the information his security team had managed to gather in the hours since the young woman had fled the gala. Her name was Eleanor Grace Templeton, Ellie for short, 23 years old, student at UC Santa Barbara, working part-time in the university's laundry service. Lived with her aunt, Patricia Templeton. Parents deceased, father unknown, mother died of complications during childbirth. Grant stared at the sparse information, particularly the last line. It contradicted what he knew, or thought he knew. If this young woman was somehow connected to Eleanor, his Eleanor, then her mother couldn't have died in childbirth, unless the records were wrong, or deliberately falsified. His fingers hovered over his phone. One call to his private investigator would set in motion a more thorough search, uncover the truth behind these discrepancies. But something held him back, the same instinct that had stopped him from following her in the garden. What if he was wrong? What if this was all just a bizarre coincidence, the name, the dress, the timing? And if he wasn't wrong, what then? What would it mean for his carefully constructed life, his marriage, his reputation? The pendant his wife had worn that evening sat on his desk, the antique locket he'd removed from her jewelry box after she'd gone to bed. He hadn't opened it yet, afraid of what he might find inside, afraid of confirming what his heart already suspected. With a deep breath, Grant picked up the locket and pressed the tiny clasp that would reveal its contents. Grant's fingers trembled slightly as he pressed the tiny clasp on the antique locket. The hinges, stiff with age and disuse, resisted for a moment before yielding with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence of his office. Inside was exactly what he had feared. A tiny photograph, yellowed with age but unmistakable. A young woman with auburn hair and a gentle smile, Eleanor Templeton, and beside her, his own younger face, grinning with the careless confidence of youth. They stood on the beach at sunset, his arm around her shoulders, her head tilted to rest against him. They looked happy, in love, unaware of the storm that would tear them apart just months after the photo was taken. Grant closed his eyes, memories washing over him like the tide. Summer, 24 years ago. He'd been a graduate student with ambitious plans and a trust fund. She'd been working at a local bookstore to pay her way through college. Their worlds shouldn't have intersected, but fate had other ideas. A spilled coffee, a ruined textbook, an offer to replace it that turned into dinner, then into something more. For 6 perfect months, they'd existed in a bubble of their own making, until her family, the prestigious Templetons of Boston, had discovered their relationship and demanded she return home. Grant had begged her to stay, to fight for what they had, but Eleanor had left anyway. Her farewell letter, tear-stained and apologetic, had offered no real explanation beyond, "We come from different worlds and some things aren't meant to be." He'd never seen her again, had spent years trying to forget her, had eventually married Meredith, the daughter of his father's business partner, a strategic alliance that had helped build the Ellington Foundation into the powerhouse it was today. And now, 20 years later, a young woman with a crooked seam on a lilac dress had walked into his gala and turned his carefully constructed reality upside down. With a deep breath, Grant slid open his desk drawer and removed a small brass key. It had hung on his keychain for years, though he'd never used it. Never had the courage to open the safe deposit box it belonged to. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would visit the bank and face whatever secrets lay waiting. As dawn broke over Santa Barbara, casting long shadows across the campus of UCSB, Ellie Templeton sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by the contents of an old cardboard box. Photographs, letters, a few pieces of jewelry too inexpensive to be valuable but too precious to discard. The sum total of what remained of her mother's life. Aunt Patty had given her the box on her 18th birthday, explaining that her mother had left it with explicit instructions that Ellie was to have it when she came of age. But grief, still raw even after 15 years, had made Ellie set it aside, largely unexplored. Now, after the humiliation of the previous night, she found herself drawn to these fragments of her mother's existence. She picked up a faded photograph, her mother, young and beautiful, standing on a beach at sunset. The photo had been torn down the middle and carefully taped back together, but the jagged edge was still visible, suggesting someone had been cropped out. Ellie had always assumed it was her unknown father, the man her mother had never spoken of, the blank space on her birth certificate. Beneath the photographs lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Ellie had skimmed them once before, correspondence between her mother and various friends during college. Nothing that offered any clues about her father's identity. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small fabric pouch. Ellie opened it carefully, tipping its contents into her palm. A delicate silver charm bracelet with only one charm. A tiny sewing machine. Attached to it was a small card yellowed with age. The handwriting was unfamiliar, written in blue ink that had faded to a ghostly gray. For Eleanor, when you grow up, sew your own story. The signature at the bottom had been deliberately crossed out, but the final letter was still visible. A flourishing G. Ellie frowned, turning the card over. There was no date, no other information, just those enigmatic words and that tantalizing fragment of a signature. G. Who was G? And why had her mother kept this card for so many years? A gentle knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Aunt Patty stood in the doorway, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands, her face lined with concern. "You're up early," she said, offering one of the mugs to Ellie. "I thought you might want to talk about last night." Ellie accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "I'm okay," she signed, using her free hand to form the simple gesture. Though she could speak, had been taught by specialists at great expense, she often preferred sign language, especially when emotional. Aunt Patty sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes falling on the scattered contents of the box. "Your mother's things," she said softly. "I haven't seen these in years." Ellie set her coffee aside and picked up the card with the mysterious signature. "Did you ever know anyone in Mom's life whose name started with G?" she asked, forming the words carefully with her hands. A shadow passed over Aunt Patty's face. There and gone so quickly Ellie almost missed it. "Why do you ask?" Ellie showed her the card. This was with her charm bracelet. "The signature is crossed out, but you can still see the G." Aunt Patty took the card, studying it with an expression Ellie couldn't quite read. Was it surprise? Worry? After a moment, she handed it back. "Your mother knew a lot of people in college," she said vaguely. "It could be anyone." But she wouldn't meet Ellie's eyes, and Ellie knew her aunt well enough to recognize when she was hiding something. Before she could press further, Aunt Patty stood abruptly. "You should eat something before class. I'll make some toast." As her aunt hurried from the room, Ellie looked down at the scattered photographs, at her mother's smiling face captured in time. For the first time, she noticed something she'd overlooked before. In several of the photos, her mother was wearing a delicate silver chain with an oval pendant. A locket, perhaps? A locket that wasn't among the items in the box. With careful fingers, Ellie gathered the photos and letters, returning them to the box. She slipped the charm bracelet onto her wrist, the single charm catching the early morning light. Something had changed within her, a quiet determination taking root. After years of accepting the gaps in her history, she suddenly needed answers. Across town, in his elegantly appointed bedroom, Grant Ellington watched his wife dress for her morning charity committee meeting. Meredith stood before the full-length mirror, fastening a pearl necklace around her throat. "You came to bed late," she remarked, her tone casual but her eyes watchful in the mirror's reflection. "Had some foundation business to catch up on," Grant replied, keeping his voice neutral. "The gala was a success, by the way. Final numbers came in. We raised over $2 million for the Children's Hospital." Meredith smiled, satisfied. "Well, worth all the planning then." She turned to face him, pearl earrings swinging gently. "About that girl last night. Let's not discuss it." Grant cut her off, more sharply than he'd intended. Softening his tone, he added, "It was unfortunate, but it's over now." Something flickered in Meredith's eyes. Calculation, perhaps, but she merely nodded. "Of course, darling. Ancient history already." As she left the room in a cloud of expensive perfume, Grant's hand moved to his pocket, where the locket now rested. Ancient history, indeed. But some histories refused to stay buried. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the small bungalow, painting golden rectangles across the worn hardwood floor. Ellie stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her aunt nervously rearrange the fruit in the bowl on the counter, a habit Patricia had when she was avoiding difficult conversations. "I need to know the truth, Aunt Patty," Ellie said, her voice carefully modulated. Years of speech therapy had given her the ability to speak clearly, but emotional moments like this made it harder to control her pitch and volume. "About my mother. About my father." Patricia's hands stilled, hovering over an apple. Her shoulders rose and fell with a deep sigh before she turned to face her niece. The afternoon light emphasized the fine lines around her eyes, making her look older than her 52 years. "Sit down, Ellie," she said, gesturing to the small kitchen table. "Please." Ellie complied, setting her mother's charm bracelet on the table between them. The tiny sewing machine charm caught the light, throwing a small, sharp-edged shadow across the worn wooden surface. Patricia stared at it for a long moment before meeting Ellie's gaze. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Ellie signed, then repeated aloud. "Everything you've never told me." Her aunt's fingers twisted together, knuckles whitening. "Your mother was so young when she had you, just 20. She'd been at college in California against your grandfather's wishes. The Templetons have had certain expectations. Ivy League schools, suitable marriages, maintaining the family's social position." Ellie nodded. She knew this much. Her mother had been the black sheep of the prestigious Boston Templetons, defying her father to attend a West Coast university. "She met someone there," Patricia continued, her voice dropping slightly. "A young man. Brilliant, charismatic, from a wealthy family, but not the right kind of wealth, according to your grandfather. New money, no pedigree. G," Ellie said softly, tapping the charm bracelet. "His name started with G." Patricia nodded slowly. "Grant. His name was Grant Ellington." Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. Grant Ellington, the name on the foundation banner at the gala, the man whose wife had torn her dress. "They were in love," Patricia continued, oblivious to Ellie's shock. "Wildly, foolishly in love. Your mother was planning to stay in California after graduation to build a life with him. Then she discovered she was pregnant. With me," Ellie whispered. Patricia nodded. She was overjoyed. Grant was overjoyed. They started making plans, marriage, a little house near the beach, the future they would build together. "What happened?" Ellie asked, though a sinking feeling in her stomach told her it couldn't have been good. "Your grandfather found out." Patricia's voice hardened. "He was furious. Threatened to cut Eleanor off completely, but that wasn't what changed her mind. Your mother never cared about the money. She paused, seeming to struggle with the next words. He hired investigators to dig into the Ellington family, found some kind of financial scandal involving Grant's father. He threatened to expose it, to ruin the Ellingtons if Eleanor didn't come home. Ellie's hands clenched into fists. So she left him. To protect him, yes. And to protect you. She knew what your grandfather was capable of when crossed. Patricia's eyes filled with tears. She came home to Boston, told everyone she'd made a mistake, that the relationship was over. Your grandfather was satisfied, started making arrangements for her to marry the son of one of his friends, to salvage the situation, as he put it. But she didn't, Ellie prompted, struggling to keep her voice steady. No. She called me in the middle of the night, 8 months pregnant, sobbing. Said she couldn't go through with it, couldn't let her baby be raised in that cold, controlling environment. I drove to Boston that night, packed her into my car, and brought her to my place in Connecticut. Ellie's heart raced as the pieces started falling into place. And Grant? Did she ever tell him about me? Patricia looked away, guilt shadowing her features. She wrote him a letter explaining everything. Your grandfather's threats, why she had to leave. She planned to mail it after you were born to tell him where to find you both. But something went wrong, Ellie guessed, her chest tightening. Patricia nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. The birth was difficult. There were complications, hemorrhaging. By the time they got her to surgery, it was too late. Her voice broke. She made me promise to take care of you, and to tell you the truth when you were old enough to understand. But you didn't, Ellie signed, her hand shaking too much to trust her voice. You let me believe my father was unknown, that my mother died of cancer when I was 8. You lied to me my entire life. I was trying to protect you. Patricia reached across the table, but Ellie pulled back. Your grandfather was still alive then, still powerful. He made it very clear that if I ever revealed the truth, if I ever tried to contact Grant Ellington, he would take you away from me. He had the money, the connections. I couldn't risk losing you. And after he died, 5 years ago? Ellie demanded, anger building in her chest. By then, Grant had built his empire, married into another powerful family. What good would disrupting his life have done? Patricia's voice was pleading. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone. Ellie stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You had no right to make that decision, no right to keep me from my father. Across town, in the private viewing room of Pacific Trust Bank, Grant Ellington sat alone, surrounded by the contents of a safe deposit box he hadn't opened in 20 years. Letters, photographs, a small velvet ring box containing the engagement ring he'd never had the chance to give Eleanor, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope addressed to him in Eleanor's elegant handwriting, dated 2 months after she'd left. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the yellowed pages within. My dearest Grant, the letter began. By the time you read this, our daughter will have been born. Grant felt the world tilt beneath him. Daughter. The word echoed in his mind, in his heart. A daughter he'd never known existed. A daughter who would now be in her early 20s. A daughter who perhaps wore a lilac dress with a crooked seam. Meanwhile, Meredith Ellington sat in her private study, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, her cell phone in the other. The screen displayed security footage from the previous night's gala. Footage she'd had the foresight to request from the hotel management for promotional purposes. She paused the video on a clear image of Ellie's face, then switched to another screen showing an old photograph of Eleanor Templeton. The resemblance was unmistakable. Meredith took a long sip of her wine, her mind racing. She'd known about Grant's college girlfriend, of course, had done her research before agreeing to marry him, had even managed to locate and quietly purchase a chest of mementos he kept hidden in the attic, hoping to erase any lingering evidence of that relationship. What she hadn't known was that there might be a child. Setting down her glass, she picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. It's Meredith, she said when the call connected. We have a situation I need you to handle immediately. The Shoreline Cafe sat perched on the edge of Santa Barbara's East Beach, its wide windows offering an uninterrupted view of the Pacific. At a corner table, Ellie fidgeted with her napkin, watching the waves crash against the shore. The text message had arrived that morning. Unexpected, direct. This is Meredith Ellington. We need to talk. Shoreline Cafe, 2 p.m. Come alone. The same woman who had torn her dress, who had humiliated her in front of a room full of strangers, now wanted to meet. Ellie's first instinct had been to ignore the message, to protect herself from further hurt. But curiosity, and the newly discovered knowledge that this woman was married to her biological father, had compelled her to accept. The cafe door opened, sending a shaft of sunlight across the polished wooden floors. Meredith Ellington entered, her designer sunglasses perched atop her perfect silver blonde hair, her linen dress crisp and immaculate despite the coastal humidity. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned their place in the world, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Ellie. A practiced smile curved her lips as she approached, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor," she said, sliding into the chair opposite Ellie. "Thank you for coming." "It's Ellie," Ellie corrected, her fingers automatically seeking the charm bracelet on her wrist, needing something to ground her. "And I almost didn't." Meredith's gaze dropped to the bracelet, lingering on the tiny sewing machine charm. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "I understand why you might be hesitant," she said, her voice honey smooth. "My behavior at the gala was regrettable." Ellie said nothing, waiting. The apology, if that's what it was, sounded rehearsed, empty of genuine remorse. A waitress approached and Meredith ordered an iced tea with a precision that bordered on hostility, specifying the exact amount of ice, a particular brand of sweetener, a specific garnish. Ellie asked for water, suddenly doubting the wisdom of meeting this woman alone. When the waitress retreated, Meredith turned her full attention to Ellie, her gaze assessing. "Let's be direct," she said, folding her manicured hands on the table. "I know who you are. I know what you want." Ellie blinked, taken aback by the bluntness. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Please." Meredith's smile thinned. "Let's not play games. I understand you've recently discovered that Grant Ellington, my husband, might be your biological father." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. How did this woman know what she'd only learned yesterday? Had Grant told her? Was this meeting his idea? "I see from your expression that I'm correct," Meredith continued, her voice dropping to ensure privacy. "I thought it best we have this conversation before things become complicated." The waitress returned with their drinks. Meredith waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. "My husband is a good man, generous to a fault sometimes. He's built something remarkable with the Ellington Foundation, providing medical care to underprivileged children, scholarships for deserving students, disaster relief worldwide." Ellie took a sip of water, trying to steady her nerves. "I don't see what that has to do with me." "Everything," Meredith replied sharply, then quickly smoothed her expression. "Grant's work depends on his reputation, on the Foundation's image. Scandals, distractions, they can damage funding, undermine years of good work." Understanding dawned, cold and clear. "You think I'm here to cause a scandal? I think you've had a difficult life. No father figure, a deceased mother, financial struggles." Meredith pulled a folder from her designer handbag, sliding it across the table. "Which is why I'm prepared to offer you this." Ellie opened the folder. Inside was a legal document, complex with jargon, but the figure at the bottom was clear enough. $250,000. "A generous settlement," Meredith explained, her voice clinical. "In exchange for your discretion and a legally binding agreement not to pursue any claims against Grant or the Ellington family." The cafe suddenly felt too warm, too small. Ellie closed the folder, pushing it back across the table. "I didn't come here for money." "Everyone wants money," Meredith countered, her practiced smile slipping. "Especially those who've never had it. This amount would change your life. Pay off student loans, buy a home, provide security." "I don't want your money," Ellie repeated, her hands starting to tremble. "I just wanted—" The truth caught in her throat. What did she want? To know her father? To understand where she came from? To have a family beyond her aunt? "What you want doesn't matter." Meredith's voice hardened, her mask of civility cracking. "What matters is protecting Grant and the Foundation. Your mother understood that 23 years ago when she left. She knew she and you would only be a distraction, a complication in a life dedicated to helping others." Anger flashed through Ellie, hot and sudden. "Don't talk about my mother. You know nothing about her." "I know enough." Meredith leaned forward, her eyes cold. "I know she was a summer romance, a pretty distraction during Grant's graduate studies. Nothing more." "That's not true." Ellie's voice was steady despite the storm inside her. "They loved each other. She only left to protect him from my grandfather's threats." Something shifted in Meredith's expression, Surprise, quickly masked. Is that the story your aunt told you? How convenient. But if your mother truly loved Grant, why did she never contact him after your grandfather died? Why maintain the lie? She died when I was born, Ellie said, the words still raw even after learning the truth. She never had the chance to tell him about me. Meredith's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, that's rich. Your aunt has quite the imagination. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to an image before sliding it across the table. Your mother, Eleanor Templeton, at a gallery opening in Boston, 2011. Ellie stared at the photograph, uncomprehending. It showed a woman in her 40s, smiling at the camera, champagne glass in hand. The resemblance to the photos in Ellie's box was undeniable, though this woman was older, more sophisticated, her auburn hair now streaked with silver. That's not possible, Ellie whispered, her world tilting beneath her. My mother died in childbirth. Aunt Patty said. Your aunt lied, Meredith stated flatly, retrieving her phone. Just as she's lying about your connection to Grant. There's no proof he's your father. Your mother had many admirers in college. Grant was just one among many. The timing may be convenient, but that doesn't make it true. Tears burned behind Ellie's eyes as confusion and betrayal warred within her. If her aunt had lied about her mother's death, what else had she lied about? Was any of what she'd been told yesterday true? Meredith watched her internal struggle with clinical detachment. It was you who destroyed your own dress at the gala, wasn't it? Creating a scene, ensuring Grant would notice you. A rather transparent ploy for attention. The accusation, so wildly false, so cruelly calculated, broke something in Ellie. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You tore my dress, she said, her voice shaking with anger. You humiliated me in front of everyone, and now you're trying to manipulate me with lies and money. Meredith remained seated, unfazed. Think carefully, Ellie. Grant's life is established, successful. The foundation helps thousands of children. Do you really want to disrupt all that for your personal curiosity? For a connection that probably doesn't even exist? Ellie gathered her bag, desperate to escape before tears overwhelmed her. I don't want anything from you or your husband. I just wanted the truth. Truth is subjective, Meredith replied coolly, and often inconvenient. My offer stands for 24 hours. After that, she let the threat hang unfinished in the air between them. Ellie fled the cafe, her vision blurring with tears. Outside, the bright sunshine seemed a mockery of the darkness swirling inside her. She stumbled down the beachside path, away from the cafe, away from Meredith's poisonous words and unsettling revelations. When she finally stopped, gasping for breath, she found herself at the university's arts complex. Inside, her ASL professor, David Chen, was setting up for the afternoon class. He looked up as she entered, his friendly smile fading to concern when he saw her tear-streaked face. Ellie? He signed, his movements gentle with worry. What's wrong? Something inside her broke. Ellie collapsed into a nearby chair, her body shaking with silent sobs. Everything she thought she knew about herself, about her mother, about her past, it was all unraveling around her. Professor Chen knelt beside her, a steady, calming presence. When her tears finally subsided, he signed slowly, making sure she could follow. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. Ellie's hands trembled as she tried to explain, her signing fragmented by emotion. Her professor watched patiently, his kind eyes never leaving her hands. Do you have someone you trust? He asked when she finished. Someone who can help you through this? Ellie shook her head. Who could she trust now? Her aunt had lied about something as fundamental as her mother's death. Meredith was actively trying to manipulate her. And Grant, her father, didn't even know she existed. Professor Chen seemed to make a decision. He pulled out his phone, typed something, then showed it to her. I'm going to call someone who might be able to help. Unknown to either of them, across town, Grant Ellington sat in his car outside Patricia Templeton's bungalow, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he gathered the courage to knock on the door and ask about the daughter he never knew he had. The Santa Barbara Convention Center buzzed with activity as staff arranged chairs in neat rows, adjusted lighting, and tested the sound system for the evening's event. Banners hung from the ceiling announcing the National American Sign Language Showcase, featuring performances and presentations from deaf artists and educators from across the country. Backstage, Ellie sat alone in a small dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The past 72 hours had transformed her life completely. After her breakdown in Professor Chen's classroom, everything had accelerated with dizzying speed. The professor's phone call had been to a journalist friend who specialized in stories about the deaf community. What was supposed to be a simple, supportive meeting had somehow evolved into an invitation for Ellie to share her story, her journey as a deaf woman navigating a hearing world, at tonight's showcase. She hadn't planned to accept, but then the journalist had mentioned casually that the Ellington Foundation was one of the event's major sponsors, that Grant Ellington himself would be attending. Now, wearing a simple blue dress borrowed from a fellow student, Ellie wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. What would she say if she came face to face with the man she believed to be her father? What if Meredith's insinuations were true, that there was no real connection, that it was all just wishful thinking? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Professor Chen entered, his expression both excited and concerned. "How are you feeling?" he signed, his movements fluid and expressive. "Terrified," Ellie signed back honestly. "I don't think I can do this." He sat in the chair beside her, his kind eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "You don't have to. No one would blame you for walking away." Ellie's fingers traced the charm bracelet on her wrist, the tiny sewing machine catching the light. "My mother never got to tell her truth," she signed slowly. "Maybe I need to tell mine." Professor Chen nodded, understanding. "The organizer wanted me to ask," his hands hesitated briefly, "if you'd be willing to speak a few words aloud, not just sign. They said it creates a powerful moment for the hearing audience members." Ellie's stomach clenched. Though she could speak, she rarely did so in public, uncomfortable with the way people sometimes reacted to her deaf accent, the slight differences in inflection and rhythm that marked her as different. "You don't have to decide now," Professor Chen added quickly. "Just think about it." As he left, Ellie turned back to the mirror. The face that looked back at her was her mother's. The same eyes, the same determined set of the jaw that she recognized from old photographs. But there was something else there too, something she'd never noticed before. The shape of her brow, the line of her nose. Were those traces of Grant Ellington? She closed her eyes, remembering the manila folder Aunt Patty had given her yesterday. After learning of Meredith's cruel deception at the cafe, Ellie had confronted her aunt again, demanding the complete truth. This time, Patricia had produced a folder containing birth records, letters, even a DNA test Eleanor had quietly arranged before her death, confirming beyond doubt that Grant was Ellie's father. Most shocking of all had been the revelation that her mother had indeed died, not during childbirth as Patricia had claimed, but of cancer when Ellie was 8, exactly as she'd always believed. The woman in Meredith's photograph wasn't Eleanor at all, but Eleanor's older sister Caroline, who bore a striking family resemblance. "She was trying to break you," Patricia had explained, tears streaming down her face, "to make you doubt everything, so you'd take the money and disappear." A second knock at the dressing room door jolted Ellie back to the present. The stage manager peeked in, signaling 5 minutes until her presentation. With a deep breath, Ellie stood and smoothed her dress. Whatever happened tonight, she would face it with the same quiet dignity her mother had shown in her final days. In the front row of the convention center, Grant Ellington sat stiffly beside his wife, a program clutched in his hands. The past 3 days had been a blur of revelations and confrontations. His visit to Patricia Templeton had confirmed everything he'd suspected. Ellie was his daughter, kept from him by circumstances and deliberate deceptions. Patricia had shown him photographs, letters, even the DNA test Eleanor had commissioned before her death. "She wanted you to know," Patricia had told him, her voice thick with regret. "Before the cancer took her, she made arrangements for the truth to come out when Ellie turned 18. But then your career exploded. The foundation became so prominent. I was afraid the truth would hurt more than it would help." Now, scanning the program, Grant had been stunned to see Ellie's name among the presenters. Eleanor Templeton. Silence and voice. A journey between worlds. According to the description, she would be sharing her experience as a deaf woman navigating between deaf and hearing communities. Beside him, Meredith sat in frigid silence. Their confrontation the previous evening had been apocalyptic. The private investigator she had hired, the manipulative meeting with Ellie, the doctored photograph, all of it had come to light when the investigator, troubled by his conscience, had forwarded their correspondence to Grant. "You've known for years," he had said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You've known I had a daughter out there somewhere, and you deliberately kept us apart. Meredith hadn't bothered to deny it. "I did what was necessary to protect what we built," she had replied coldly. "The foundation, our position, our legacy. She would have ruined everything." The divorce papers had been drawn up that morning. The only reason Meredith was here tonight was to maintain appearances until the foundation's board could be properly informed. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. The showcase host, a prominent deaf activist, took the stage to welcome everyone in both spoken English and ASL. Grant barely registered the words, his mind racing ahead to the moment when Ellie would appear. When she finally walked onto the stage, the spotlight catching on her dark hair, Grant felt his breath catch. She moved with Eleanor's grace, held herself with the same quiet dignity, but there was something of him there too, in her height, in the set of her shoulders as she faced the audience. Ellie began signing, her movements elegant and expressive, while a voice interpreter spoke her words aloud for the hearing audience members. She shared her experiences growing up deaf, the challenges and triumphs, the beauty she found in visual language. The audience was captivated, many wiping away tears as she described her mother's death, the isolation she had felt afterward. "My mother taught me that silence isn't emptiness," the interpreter translated as Ellie's hands moved. "It's a space waiting to be filled with understanding, with connection." As her presentation neared its end, Ellie paused, her hands falling still. She glanced at Professor Chen, who sat at the side of the stage, and received an encouraging nod. Taking a visible deep breath, she stepped closer to the microphone. The audience waited, unsure what was happening. Grant leaned forward in his seat, hands gripping the armrests. "I want," Ellie began, her voice hesitant, the deaf accent noticeable but her words clear. "I want to say one thing, in my own voice." A hush fell over the convention center, hundreds holding their breath collectively. Ellie's eyes scanned the crowd, landing finally on Grant in the front row. For a long moment their gazes locked, recognition passing between them like an electric current. "Dad," she said, the single word carrying across the silence of the hall. Grant rose to his feet, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Around him, the audience erupted in applause, assuming this was part of the presentation, a powerful moment symbolizing the bridge between silence and sound. But for Grant and Ellie, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, father and daughter connecting across 23 years of separation, across a distance that now seemed both vast and infinitesimal. As the applause continued, Grant moved toward the stage, drawn by a force beyond conscious thought. Meredith reached to stop him, but he shook off her hand without a glance. Nothing would keep him from his daughter any longer. Ellie watched him approach, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her chest. This was the moment everything changed. Again, for better or worse, there would be no going back. 6 months had passed since that night at the convention center. The Santa Barbara Museum of Contemporary Art buzzed with excitement as patrons in elegant evening wear circulated through the gallery, champagne flutes in hand, admiring the installations of visible seams, narratives in textile. At the center of the main exhibition hall, displayed on a mannequin under soft spotlights, hung a lilac dress with a carefully restored tier from shoulder to waist. The tier had been mended with deliberate, visible stitches that transformed the damage into an artistic statement, each stitch a different color, creating a rainbow path down the side of the garment. A small plaque beside it read, "Broken Silence, Ellie Templeton, lilac fabric, thread, memory. The places where we tear can become the most beautiful parts of us when mended with love." Ellie stood at a distance, watching as visitors gathered around her creation, pointing and discussing the unconventional repair technique. She wore a simple black dress of her own design, featuring intentionally visible seams and contrasting white thread. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant twist, revealing delicate silver earrings shaped like tiny spools of thread, a gift from her father. "Nervous?" Grant asked, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of sparkling water. His question was both spoken and signed, his hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had spent the past 6 months diligently learning a new language. Ellie smiled, accepting the glass. "A little," she signed back. "I still can't believe people actually want to see my work." "I can," Grant replied, his eyes filled with unmistakable pride. "Your designs are extraordinary. The way you've transformed imperfection into a statement about resilience, it's powerful." The journey to this moment had not been easy. After their emotional reunion at the convention center, there had been weeks of awkward conversations, difficult questions, and painful revelations. The tabloids had feasted on the story of the billionaire philanthropist discovering his long-lost deaf daughter, speculating wildly about motivations and implications. Meredith had launched a brief but vicious publicity campaign, attempting to paint Ellie as an opportunistic imposter, before the DNA test results silenced her definitively. The divorce proceedings had been equally brutal, with Meredith fighting for control of the foundation, until a former assistant came forward with evidence of her misappropriation of funds over several years. The scandal had threatened to overshadow the foundation's work, until Grant made the decision to step back temporarily, appointing a respected board member as interim director, while he focused on building a relationship with his daughter. Now, 6 months later, father and daughter stood side by side watching as the art world embraced Ellie's unique vision, garments that celebrated rather than concealed their flaws, that turned vulnerability into strength. "Your mother would be so proud," Grant said softly, his voice catching slightly. They had visited Eleanor's grave together the previous month, bringing lilacs and sharing stories. Grant told Ellie about the young woman who had captured his heart in a bookstore. Ellie shared memories of the mother who had taught her to find beauty in silence. Across the gallery, Professor Chen was animatedly describing Ellie's work to a group of students from the university's Deaf Studies program. When he caught her eye, he gave an enthusiastic thumbs up. Beside him stood Aunt Patty, elegant in a navy dress, deep in conversation with the museum curator. Their relationship had weathered its own storms of forgiveness and reconciliation, emerging stronger for the honesty that now existed between them. "Ms. Templeton?" A young woman approached, her hands moving fluidly in ASL. "I'm Jessica from Deaf Artist Collective. Your work is incredible. Would you consider being our featured creator for next month's showcase?" As Ellie engaged in conversation with Jessica, Grant stepped back, giving them space. His gaze drifted to the lilac dress, the catalyst that had brought his daughter back into his life. The memory of that night at the gala still made his chest tighten. Meredith's casual cruelty, Ellie's quiet dignity, that distinctive crooked seam that had stirred recognition deep in his soul. He hadn't known then how completely his world was about to change, how the daughter he never knew existed would fill a void in his heart he hadn't fully acknowledged. The past 6 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of his life, learning to communicate in a new language, discovering the remarkable young woman his daughter had become despite, or perhaps because of, the obstacles she had faced. A gentle tap on his arm pulled Grant from his reflections. Ellie stood before him, her expression bright with excitement. "The Deaf Artist Collective wants me to create a full collection for their annual exhibition," she signed, her movements quick with enthusiasm. "And they've invited me to teach a workshop on textile art as expression for deaf youth." "That's wonderful," Grant replied, his signing still somewhat hesitant but improving daily. "You'll be an incredible mentor." Ellie's smile faltered slightly. "Do you think I'm ready for something like that? Teaching others?" Grant considered her question seriously. In the months they'd known each other, he had learned that his daughter didn't want platitudes or empty reassurances. She wanted honesty, even when it was difficult. "I think," he began carefully, "that you have a unique voice that deserves to be shared. Not despite your challenges, but because of how they've shaped your perspective." His gaze drifted to the lilac dress. "That garment tells a story that resonates with people because it's authentic. You took something broken and made it more beautiful than it was before. That's a powerful lesson to share." Ellie followed his gaze to the dress, her mother's final gift, transformed by damage and restoration into something new. The visible mending had become her signature technique, a metaphor for her own life. "The places where we break can become our greatest strength when embraced rather than hidden." "I used to hate that color," she signed, her expression softening with memory. "Lilac reminded me too much of Mom, of what I'd lost." "And now?" Grant asked gently. "Now it reminds me of what I've found," she replied, her hands forming the signs with graceful precision. "It reminds me that beauty can come from broken places." A hush fell over the gallery as the museum director approached the center of the room, gently tapping a glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the artist whose work has captivated us all tonight. Please welcome Ellie Templeton." As applause filled the room, Ellie moved forward, standing tall beside her creation. An interpreter positioned himself nearby, ready to translate her signs for the hearing audience members. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Ellie began, her hands dancing through the air, giving shape to her thoughts. "This dress has a story to tell. About loss, about reconnection, about finding beauty in unexpected places." Her eyes found Grant's in the crowd, and they shared a smile of quiet understanding. "The color I once hated," she continued, her fingers caressing the fabric of the dress, "now clothes me in love." As the audience applauded again, a group of children from the local school for the deaf filed into the gallery, their eyes wide with wonder as they took in the vibrant creations surrounding them. Each child wore a small name tag featuring both their name and its representation in ASL fingerspelling. Ellie's face lit up at the sight of them. These were the children who attended the weekend art workshops she had started at the Ellington Foundation's newly launched Center for Deaf Arts and Education, Grant's first project upon returning to the foundation after his brief hiatus. As the children gathered around her, their small hands flying with questions and comments, Ellie felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. The silence that had defined her life had become not a limitation, but a different way of experiencing the world, one she could now share with others. Grant watched from a distance, his heart full beyond measure. The foundation that had once been his life's purpose had evolved into something even more meaningful, a bridge between worlds, just as his daughter was a bridge between silence and sound, between loss and discovery, between what was broken and what could be beautifully remade. Ellie and Grant's journey reminds us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strength when embraced rather than hidden. Like the visible stitches that transformed a torn dress into a work of art, our broken places tell a story of resilience and hope. Sometimes the very things we try to conceal become the most beautiful parts of who we are, when mended with love and acceptance. What would you do if the life you thought you knew suddenly unraveled? Would you have Ellie's courage to seek the truth despite the pain it might bring? Or Grant's willingness to open his heart to a connection he never knew existed? Perhaps Meredith's story reminds us that the walls we build to protect ourselves often become the prisons that confine us. In the silence between words, in the spaces between stitches, we find our truest connections, if only we have the courage to look. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey. If Ellie and Grant's story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear this message of healing and reconciliation, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to mend what's broken and weave a new pattern from the threads of your past.